That night, Zhang and Wanting's wedding caused quite a stir in the small town. The event was grand and luxurious, with almost everyone from the town's elite attending to celebrate the couple. The banquet hall was brightly lit, decorated with flowers and ribbons, like something out of a dream. The groom, Zhang, looked sharp in his suit, and the bride, Wanting, beamed in her white wedding dress. Everyone was blessing the happy couple. Standing next to Wanting was her cousin, Li Ruo, who was the bridesmaid. Li Ruo looked a bit nervous, but kept a polite smile on her face. Li Ruo had always been shy and quiet, not good at socializing, but she had a strong bond with Wanting. Despite her nervousness, she agreed to be the bridesmaid. However, the joyful atmosphere of the wedding gradually took a dark turn due to the effects of alcohol. As the night went on, guests were drinking, toasting, and laughing. Zhang's friends, one by one, got drunk. At first, they were just joking around, making some harmless fun. But as more alcohol flowed, their behavior changed. A few of Zhang's drunken friends turned their attention to Li Ruo, and their words became increasingly rude. One of them got close to her, speaking in a lewd tone, while another reached out to pull at her dress. At first, Li Ruo tried to avoid them, frowning and stepping away, but they surrounded her like predators closing in on their prey, forcing her into a corner of the banquet hall. Wanting noticed the situation and rushed over to help, but she was no match for the group of drunk men. Zhang was busy greeting other guests and didn't notice the chaos happening nearby. Li Ruo was filled with fear and humiliation. She struggled, but the drunk men didn't care. In front of everyone, they yanked down her dress strap. The scene became a mess. Some people saw it, but no one dared to intervene. When things escalated and they dragged Li Ruo into a small room, Wanting and her bridesmaids burst in just in time to stop them from doing worse. Li Ruo, overwhelmed by shame and despair, pushed them away and fled the hall, her mind in turmoil. She ran through the dark streets, tears streaming down her face. The cold night wind hit her, but it couldn't cool the fire of humiliation burning inside her. Li Ruo kept running, eventually reaching the woods outside of town, a place she used to visit as a child. But now it felt eerie and ominous. Her legs grew heavy, her thoughts a blur. The pain and disgrace consumed her mind. After the wedding, Wanting realized Li Ruo had been missing for hours. A terrible feeling crept over her. She immediately gathered Zhang and a few friends from town, and they all went searching for Li Ruo. That night, the sky was dark, with clouds covering the moon. The wind howled through the trees, making the whole forest feel even more frightening. They searched through the woods with flashlights, the atmosphere growing more tense by the minute. Finally, after nearly 2 hours, they found Li Ruo near an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The sight was one that Wanting would never forget. Li Ruo had hanged herself. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, and her eyes were half open, showing the pain and despair she felt before dying. The ground beneath her feet was disturbed, as if she had tried to fight back in her final moments, but couldn't escape her fate. Li Ruo's death shocked the entire town. The police investigated, and the men who harassed her were brought in for questioning. But because of their powerful family connections and lack of strong evidence, they were never properly punished. The people of the town were angry but powerless. They chose to stay silent, and over time, Li Ruo's death was quietly forgotten, as if it had never happened. The town returned to its calm, ordinary life, or so it seemed. But the real terror had only just begun. The first to die was Zhang Qiang. One night, while alone at home, he woke up to a sudden chill. He looked around and noticed that his room had grown unnaturally cold. There was even a thin layer of frost on the window. He scanned the room and froze when he saw a figure standing by his bed. It was a woman, dressed in a bridesmaid's dress. Her face was pale, her eyes cold, staring straight at him. Zhang Qiang was terrified, but his body wouldn't move. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The woman slowly moved closer, a strange smile creeping across her face. The next morning, Zhang Qiang was found dead in his home. The police ruled it a heart attack, but the people of the town knew something wasn't right. After that, the other men who had harassed Li Ruo began to die one by one. Some suffocated in their sleep, while others met mysterious accidents while out. Each one died with a look of pure terror on their face, as if they had seen something too horrible to describe. Rumors started to spread that Li Ruo's ghost had come back for revenge. Zhang, who hadn't taken part in the harassment, began to feel increasingly uneasy. After seeing his friends die one after another, his discomfort turned to fear. He tried to investigate the deaths, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find any rational explanation. One night, Zhang was jolted awake from a nightmare. In the dream, he had seen Li Ruo standing in her bridesmaid's dress, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger, walking slowly toward her death. He awoke drenched in sweat. The room was silent, but the air was thick with a chilling presence. Zhang knew Li Ruo's ghost wouldn't harm him. He had never done anything to her. But those who had wronged her had all paid the price. Each time someone died, Zhang felt a mix of emotions, relief that he was spared, and sorrow for the tragedy that had unfolded. In the end, Li Ruo's ghost completed her revenge, and no more accidents occurred. Zhang, burdened with guilt and sorrow, eventually left the town, hoping to escape the curse that hung over the land. But no matter how far he went, he could never forget the wedding or the look in Li Ruo's eyes. Back in the small town, people stopped talking about the wedding, and Li Ruo's name became a forbidden subject. Everyone knew that, even though her ghost was no longer seen, her resentment still lingered in the town, like a wound that would never heal.
A rainy evening, and my friends and I decided to visit Fuji, the most famous dumpling house in town. The place had an old, worn-out look with flickering lanterns casting eerie shadows on the walls. Despite its shabby appearance, the rich aroma of dumplings filled the air, making my stomach rumble with anticipation. We took a seat by the window, the raindrops tapping softly against the glass. Old Fu, the owner, emerged from the kitchen with a broad smile that seemed just a bit too friendly, his eyes crinkling like he knew a secret. The town was full of stories about his dumplings, how they were irresistibly delicious, unlike anything you'd find anywhere else. Some people whispered that he had a secret ingredient, something that made the dumplings almost addictive. But tonight, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I just wanted to enjoy a good meal. When the baskets of dumplings arrived, I felt a wave of relief. The dumplings looked perfect, their skins translucent and revealing the succulent filling inside. I picked one up with my chopsticks, dipped it into the red sauce, and took a bite. The flavors were intense and savory, just as I remembered. But then I heard a sharp gasp from across the table. I looked up to see Xiao Wang's face twisted in disgust. He spat something into his hand, and my heart skipped a beat as I leaned closer to see what it was. There, in his palm, was a human fingernail. Yellowed, cracked, and unmistakably real. The sight of it made my stomach turn, the taste of the dumpling suddenly bitter in my mouth. "What is this?" Xiao Wang's voice was shaky, his face pale. "There's a fingernail in my dumpling." The table fell silent. Around us, other diners started to notice the commotion, whispering among themselves. The cozy warmth of the dumpling house turned cold and unsettling. I glanced at old Fu, who had come out to see what was happening. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of shock, or maybe it was fear. "Old Fu, what's going on?" I demanded, pointing at the fingernail. "This is disgusting." Old Fu raised his hands, his face a mask of confusion. "I don't know how that got there," he stuttered. "I make all the fillings myself. I swear there's nothing like that in my dumplings." But as he spoke, I noticed a shadowy figure standing in the doorway to the kitchen. It was Li Si, the butcher from the outskirts of town, known for his strange demeanor and meat that always seemed too fresh. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he was watching us closely. The atmosphere grew tense as more diners discovered similar gruesome findings in their dumplings. I knew we couldn't just sit there, we had to do something. "Call the police," I said to Xiao Wang. He nodded, pulling out his phone with shaky hands. When the police arrived, the small restaurant was buzzing with fear and anger. People were demanding answers, some shouting at old Fu while others sat in stunned silence. The officers quickly took control, moving through the crowd towards our table. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his gaze falling on the fingernail on the table. I explained what happened, my voice filled with disgust and disbelief. The officer's expression hardened as he turned to old Fu. "We need to inspect your kitchen," he said, motioning for old Fu to lead the way. Old Fu nodded nervously, glancing back at Li Si, who stood like a statue, his eyes cold and calculating. In the cramped kitchen, the police began their search. The scent of spices was thick in the air, but there was something else too, something metallic and sour. It didn't take long for one of the officers to find a large, blood-stained bag hidden in the corner. He pulled it open, revealing a pile of raw meat, dark and glistening. "What kind of meat is this?" the officer demanded, his voice sharp. Old Fu's face went pale and he stammered, I don't know." "That's from Li Si, he brings the meat." "I just cook it." All eyes turned to Li Si, who finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You wanted to know where the meat comes from," he said with a chilling smile. "Now you know. It's fresh, isn't it?" At that moment, everything fell into place. This wasn't just about a fingernail in a dumpling. It was something far worse, a dark partnership between old Fu and Li Si, turning unsuspecting customers into unwitting cannibals. As the police stood there stunned by the revelation, Li Si's chilling smile remained. The room was silent except for the muffled sound of rain against the windows. I could see the horror dawning on everyone's faces as they realized what we had been eating. My stomach churned at the thought, and I had to fight the urge to throw up. One of the officers finally broke the silence. "We need to search your premises," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his unease. Li Si simply nodded, his smile fading into an indifferent stare. The officers led him out of the dumpling house and into a police car, while a few stayed behind to continue inspecting the kitchen. As they opened more bags and containers, the evidence was undeniable: chunks of flesh, bones, and other gruesome remnants. It was clear that this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It had been happening for a long time. I couldn't stay there any longer. The air was thick with the stench of blood and something far worse, a sickening sense of betrayal. I stumbled out of the restaurant, gulping down fresh air, trying to clear my head. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that fingernail or the butcher's twisted grin. After the police took Li Si and old Fu away, my friends and I, along with many other townspeople, stayed near the dumpling house, too shaken to simply go home. We didn't follow the police directly to Li Si's house, but word spread quickly in a small town like ours. It wasn't long before we all heard what had happened. The police arrived at Li Si's house, and as they forced their way in, were immediately hit by a foul stench that made some of them gag. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rotting flesh and something even more rancid that permeated the air. They pushed forward, determined to find out what lay inside despite the overwhelming odor. As the officers moved deeper into the house, they stumbled upon a staircase leading down to a basement. Bracing themselves, they descended into the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the thick, murky air. What they found there was beyond anyone's worst nightmares. The basement was like a scene from a horror film. Bodies, or what was left of them, hung from hooks on the ceiling. The walls were stained with blood, and the floor was littered with discarded body parts, tools, and buckets filled with what could only be described as human remains. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and decay, making it almost impossible to breathe. The officers, though trained for difficult situations, were visibly shaken by the gruesome scene. They called for backup and quickly sealed off the area, knowing that this was now a crime scene of the worst kind. As the investigation continued, more chilling details emerged. Li Si had been targeting the most vulnerable, homeless people, drifters, and those without family or anyone to notice if they disappeared. He would approach them with a deceptive smile, offering food and shelter, gaining their trust with his seemingly kind demeanor. Once he lured them back to his house, he would sedate them. When they woke up, they would find themselves chained in his basement, facing a grim fate. Li Si, using his skills as a butcher, would dismember the bodies, treating them as if they were mere livestock. He meticulously prepared the human flesh, disguising it as regular meat before delivering it to Old Fu. Old Fu, motivated by greed, chose to ignore the questionable origins of the meat. As long as it kept his customers happy and his business thriving, he turned a blind eye to what he must have suspected. He turned the flesh into dumplings, serving them without a second thought. The evidence the police uncovered was undeniable and horrifying. Based on what they found, both Li Si and Old Fu were arrested on the spot that same day. As they were led away from Li Si's house, the crowd that had gathered watched in stunned silence. Old Fu looked terrified, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Li Si, however, remained disturbingly calm, his expression flat, showing no signs of remorse. Seeing them taken away left a heavy weight in the air. It was hard to reconcile that these two men, who had been part of our everyday lives, could commit such monstrous acts. The reality of their crimes shattered any sense of normalcy we had left. The nightmare was over, but the memory of what they had done would haunt us for a long time. As the police cars drove them away, a profound sense of loss settled over us, not just for the victims, but for the innocents our town had lost. The trust we once had in our community was gone, replaced by a lingering shadow that would take a long time to fade.
In a rural village in China during the late 1990s, Tang was a highly respected carpenter, known for his excellent skills. The villagers trusted him completely. He had worked hard for many years and gained a reputation for being both skilled and honest. However, in the same village, there was another man, Old Wang, who was infamous for his ruthless behavior. He was a notorious bully, controlling several local vegetable markets with an iron fist. His reputation for cruelty and dishonesty spread far and wide, and no one in the village dared to oppose him. One day, Old Wang approached Tang with a plan. He wanted Tang to build a grand mansion for him, a house that would show off his wealth and power. When Old Wang arrived at Tang's house, he wore a smile, but it was clear he was calculating something. "Tang, I've heard about your skills. I want you to build me a house that will be the biggest and most beautiful in the village," Old Wang said confidently. Tang, knowing Old Wang's fearsome reputation, hesitated but felt he had no choice. Refusing Old Wang could bring trouble. "All right, I'll do it," Tang agreed, though he was uneasy inside. The project started, and at first, everything went well. Tang and his team of workers quickly began building the house. Within just a few days, the walls were already up to half the height of a person. Everyone worked hard, eager to complete the project on time. However, it didn't take long for problems to surface. According to local customs, the homeowner should provide workers with food, water, and cigarettes while they were working. The meals didn't have to be fancy, but they had to include meat and fresh vegetables to keep the workers strong. But Old Wang, despite being rich, refused to provide even basic supplies. The workers received stale vegetables and water only occasionally, and cigarettes were completely out of the question. "Boss, we're barely making it through the day. We haven't even had water today," one of the workers complained to Tang as they sat exhausted during a break. Tang sighed heavily. "I know, but Old Wang doesn't care about us. We'll just have to keep going, or we won't get paid." The workers' spirits began to drop. Their energy was low, and some even fell sick from the poor food and lack of water. Old Wang, instead of showing sympathy, would sometimes visit the construction site to mock the workers. "You're being paid, aren't you? Stop whining about food. If you can't handle it, maybe you're not cut out for the job," he would sneer, showing no concern for their well-being. As the days dragged on, the workers grew weaker, but they couldn't afford to stop. They knew that Old Wang was the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to withhold their pay if the house wasn't completed. Then came the day to install the roof beam, one of the most critical steps in the construction. According to tradition, on this day, the homeowner was supposed to prepare a big feast with 8 dishes and 8 bowls of soup for the workers, as well as give a red envelope to the head carpenter. The workers were hopeful that, at least for this important occasion, Old Wang would follow the tradition. Tang, trying to keep things polite, went to Old Wang's house that morning. "Old Wang, today is the day we install the roof beam. It's a significant part of the project, and we were wondering if you could..." Tang started to explain, referring to the feast and red envelope. Before he could finish, Old Wang's face turned dark with anger. "Feast? Red envelope? Who do you think you are, making demands of me? You're already getting paid. That's more than enough." Tang, holding back his frustration, replied, "Old Wang, it's not about the money. The workers are exhausted, and following the tradition would at least show some respect for their hard work." But Old Wang wasn't having it. "Respect? You work for me. You'll get your pay when the house is done. Until then, don't expect anything extra," he snapped. Seeing that Tang was starting to argue, Old Wang immediately called for his thugs, who arrived within minutes. These men had helped him control the local markets and were known for their brutal tactics. Without hesitation, they attacked Tang, hitting him in the head with stones until blood poured down his face. The other workers watched in fear, but none dared to interfere. Old Wang had made his point clear. He was in control, and no one could challenge him. Despite his injuries, Tang returned to work the next day. His head was bandaged, but his determination had hardened. He knew now that Old Wang had no respect for him or the workers, but he wasn't going to leave the job unfinished. There was something else on Tang's mind, something darker. As Tang climbed the ladder to install the final roof beam, he did so with a grim sense of purpose. Unknown to anyone, Tang had learned of an ancient carpenter's curse, a spell that could bring misfortune upon those who deserved it. As he hammered the last nails into the beam, he whispered quietly to himself, invoking the curse. 7 nails, each one representing a disaster that would soon befall Old Wang and his family. "Let this house be your undoing," Tang muttered under his breath, his eyes cold and focused as he finished the job. A month after the house was completed, Old Wang's family moved in. At first, everything seemed normal, but then strange things started to happen. Old Wang's elderly mother suddenly fell ill and died. His wife, unable to bear the constant misfortune, left him. His daughter's engagement to a local official was abruptly called off, causing further embarrassment for the family. Old Wang was confused and angry, but he dismissed these events as bad luck. However, as the nights went on, Old Wang began to hear strange noises in the house, especially from the roof. At first, it was just faint whispers, but soon it grew louder, like someone or something was crying. Old Wang's nerves started to fray. He couldn't sleep, and he was constantly on edge. One evening, while walking home, lost in his thoughts, Old Wang was hit by a speeding car and died instantly. His once powerful presence in the village was gone in an instant. After Old Wang's death, his family quickly sold the cursed house. The new owner, a businessman from the city, planned to renovate the property. But when the workers began to dismantle the roof, they found something shocking. 7 large iron nails driven into the main beam of the house. The nails were twisted and unnatural, unlike any they had seen before. Rumors spread quickly through the village. "Those nails, they're cursed," an old carpenter whispered. "This house was doomed from the start." The new owner, terrified by the rumors, decided to tear the entire house down and rebuild from scratch. Once the house was demolished, the strange occurrences stopped, but the village never forgot the story of Old Wang's cursed mansion. Tang, meanwhile, carried on with his life. He never spoke of the curse he had placed, but the villagers began to look at him differently. Some whispered that Tang had been the cause of Old Wang's downfall, but no one dared confront him. As the years went by, the legend of Old Wang's cursed house became a part of the village's dark history, and Tang's name was forever linked to the mysterious and terrible events that followed the construction of that house.
Kenji sat at his desk, staring blankly at a bank statement, his mind racing. The numbers in front of him blurred, but one detail stood out. A large transfer to a law firm, Matsui Legal Office. Yumiko hadn't mentioned anything about it. The thought gnawed at him. Why would she keep this from him? For weeks, he had noticed small things. At first, they seemed insignificant. Yumiko working late, taking calls outside, sometimes disappearing for hours with vague explanations. She always said it was work. But lately, the excuses felt thin, and Kenji couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. He sighed and put the statement aside, but the questions wouldn't leave his mind. What was she hiding? As the days passed, Kenji's unease grew. Yumiko's behavior became more secretive. She constantly glanced at her phone, and whenever Kenji entered the room, she would quickly hide it. Conversations were shorter, her smiles felt forced, and there was a noticeable distance between them. One evening, Kenji lay awake, Yumiko sound asleep beside him. He couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, he slipped out of bed and crept into the kitchen, where Yumiko's phone was charging. His heart pounded as he unlocked it. He knew her password. It hadn't changed. Scrolling through her messages, everything seemed normal at first. Chats with coworkers, friends, family. But then, one message caught his eye. Transfer complete. Everything's ready. His pulse quickened. Transfer? What transfer? He continued scrolling, but many conversations had been deleted. His mind raced. Was she hiding something big? He put the phone down, his thoughts in turmoil. Was his wife involved in something he couldn't imagine? The next morning, as Kenji tried to process what he had found, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Hesitant, he answered. "Kenji?" a voice said on the other end. "It's Ryo Takahashi. We need to talk." Kenji froze. He recognized the name. Ryo was the brother of Aisuke, Yumiko's ex-boyfriend who had died in a hiking accident years ago. "I know this is sudden," Ryo continued, his voice calm but firm, "but you need to be careful. Your wife isn't who you think she is. Eisuke's death wasn't an accident. Yumiko's involved in something dangerous, and you might be next." Kenji's heart sank. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I can't explain everything over the phone, but you need to start paying attention to what she's doing. Don't trust her, Kenji. She's hiding more than you know." Ryo hung up before Kenji could ask more. Kenji sat there, the phone still in his hand. Could it be true? Could Yumiko really be hiding something this serious? Kenji's mind was spinning. Ryo's words echoed in his head. Don't trust her. Over the next few days, Kenji began watching Yumiko more closely, carefully observing her every move. He tracked her whereabouts, watched how she interacted with people, and monitored her phone when she left it unattended. What he found made his stomach turn. Large amounts of money were being transferred into offshore accounts under names he didn't recognize. The amounts were staggering, and the pattern suggested that this had been going on for a while. Each transaction was meticulously hidden, routed through different countries, making it almost impossible to trace. He also noticed her calls. Late at night, Yumiko would slip out onto the balcony to make quiet phone calls. When Kenji asked her about them, she brushed him off. "Just work," she'd say, but her tone was distant, and her explanations felt rehearsed. One evening, Kenji followed her. She met with a man in a quiet cafe, exchanging documents in a way that made Kenji's skin crawl. He didn't recognize the man, but the way they spoke made it clear that this wasn't a friendly meeting. Kenji's paranoia grew. He barely slept, plagued by nightmares where Yumiko stood over him, cold and emotionless, holding a knife. He woke up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the image from his mind. Yumiko suggested a trip to Hokkaido soon after. "We need a break," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just you and me. Let's get away for a few days." Kenji's gut twisted. Hokkaido? Remote, isolated, far from anyone who could help. It felt like a trap. He agreed to go, but in his mind he was already planning for the worst. The trip started innocently enough. Yumiko was cheerful, almost too cheerful, and Kenji couldn't relax. Every moment felt like it could be the last time he'd see her true intentions. On the second day, Yumiko suggested they take a hike up a mountain trail. "It'll be beautiful up there," she said, her voice light, almost carefree. Kenji's heart pounded as they walked the narrow path. His eyes darted around, looking for anything that seemed out of place. But it was just the two of them, surrounded by the quiet wilderness. As they reached the edge of a cliff, Kenji couldn't take it anymore. The tension was unbearable. He turned to face her, his voice trembling. "What are you hiding from me, Yumiko? What's going on with the money? The secret phone calls? Why are we here?" Yumiko's expression shifted. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she sighed deeply and sat down on a nearby rock. "I didn't want to tell you like this," she said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But you deserve to know the truth." Kenji stood frozen, unsure of what was coming next. Yumiko began to speak, her words slow and deliberate. Years ago, she had been involved in a financial scheme with Aisuke. It had started as something small, something they thought they could control. But the deeper they got into it, the more dangerous it became. Aisuke had wanted to leave the life behind, to go straight and build a future with Yumiko. But Ryo wouldn't let him. Ryo had relied on Eisuke's cooperation, and when Eisuke tried to back out, Ryo killed him in a fit of rage during a hike. He had staged the accident to make it look like a tragedy, and Yumiko had been living in fear ever since. Ryo had been blackmailing her, forcing her to move money through hidden accounts, using her financial skills to cover up his crimes. The large transfers Kenji had found were part of her plan to escape Ryo's control. She had been trying to gather enough money to disappear, to take Kenji with her and start a new life far from Ryo's reach. Yumiko's voice broke as she finished. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I've been trying to protect you." Before Kenji could process everything, a rustling sound came from behind them. Kenji turned to see Ryo stepping out of the trees, his face twisted with anger. "Yumiko," he growled, his voice cold. "You weren't supposed to tell him." Kenji's blood ran cold. Ryo had followed them to Hokkaido. He had known all along. Ryo stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Yumiko. "You thought you could get away from me? You thought you could just run?" Kenji's heart raced as he moved to stand between Yumiko and Ryo. "Stay away from her," he said, his voice shaking but determined. Ryo smirked. "You don't understand, do you, Kenji? She's been lying to you this whole time. She's as much a part of this as I am." Kenji's mind spun. Who was telling the truth? Was Yumiko really innocent, or had she played him all along? Just as the tension reached its peak, police sirens echoed in the distance. Yumiko had contacted the authorities before the trip, setting up Ryo's downfall. The police arrived moments later, and Ryo's smug expression faded as he was arrested. Back in Tokyo, Kenji sat in his apartment, staring out at the city skyline. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, confusion, guilt. The woman he had once doubted had been trying to protect him all along, but the scars left by the secrets, lies, and danger were deep. Yumiko sat beside him, silent, her hand resting lightly on his. They had survived, but their relationship had been shattered by the weight of everything that had happened. As the sun set over the city, Kenji knew one thing for sure. They had a long road ahead of them, and rebuilding what had been broken would take time. But for the first time in a long time, they were free.
Months ago, everything changed in an instant. A flash of metal, a screech of brakes, and then darkness. The car accident took my sight, plunging me into a world where shadows and light no longer existed. My parents, desperate to help me adjust, moved us to a secluded old villa on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be a peaceful place for recovery, but to me it felt more like a cage. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, as if something unseen was lurking in the corners, watching. This morning I woke up and for the first time since the accident, I could see. At first, everything was hazy, like looking through fogged glass. But then the shapes sharpened and the colors brightened. I could see the sunlight streaming through the curtains, the dust dancing in the light. My heart soared. I could see again. I wanted to shout for my parents, to tell them the miracle that had happened. But then I saw it. A piece of paper on the floor beside my bed. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. "Don't tell them you can see." I froze, my mind racing. Who wrote this? Why shouldn't I tell them? A chill ran through me, but I knew one thing. I had to keep quiet until I figured out what was happening. I dressed slowly, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my clothes, pretending to be blind. As I made my way down the stairs, I heard voices, soft, murmuring, familiar, yet wrong. I turned my head slightly, careful to keep my eyes unfocused as if I were still in the dark. When I stepped into the living room, my stomach twisted. Two strangers were sitting where my parents should have been. They wore my parents' clothes and had similar features, but the differences were glaring. The woman's hair was too dark, the man's face too thin, and their eyes were empty, cold, like they didn't belong to humans. "Morning, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice too bright, forced, like she was trying to be cheerful but didn't quite know how. "Did you sleep well?" the man added, his voice rough, like he was forcing the words through a throat that hadn't spoken in years. I nodded, forcing myself to keep my gaze blank and my head turned slightly away. "Yeah, same as always." I could feel their eyes on me, studying, searching for any hint that I could see them. I had to act normal, pretend I was still blind. I couldn't let them know the truth. Not yet. As soon as I could, I made an excuse to go back to my room, saying I was feeling tired and needed to rest. Once inside, I closed the door quietly and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Jason's number. Jason, my husband, the one person I trusted more than anyone. "Jess?" he answered, his voice warm and familiar. "What's going on? Are you okay?" "I can see again, Jason," I whispered, keeping my voice low. "But something's wrong. The people downstairs, they're not my parents. They look like them, but they're not." "What do you mean?" Jason's tone shifted, becoming sharper, more alert. "I don't know who they are, but they're pretending to be Mom and Dad. I'm scared, Jason. I don't know what to do." "Listen to me," Jason said firmly. "I just got back from my trip. I'm coming to you right now. Stay put and don't do anything rash." An hour passed like a lifetime, every second dragging. When Jason called again, his voice was laced with confusion and worry. "Jess, I'm at the house, but it's empty. There's no one here. It looks like it's been abandoned for months." My heart pounded in my chest. "Jason, I'm here. I'm inside. I saw them. I talked to them. They're real." "No, Jess. I'm telling you there's no one here. Are you sure you're in the right place?" I didn't hang up. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were filled with lead as I moved back down the hallway, creeping quietly, listening to the murmurs below. As I reached the staircase, I peered around the corner into the kitchen. The strangers had their backs to me, the woman whispering something to the man, her voice too low to hear clearly. Then he turned and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The man was holding a large, blood-stained knife. His hands were slick with red, dripping onto the floor, and his face was twisted in a cold, detached focus. My eyes followed his movements as he knelt beside an open cabinet door. Inside, I saw my mother's body sprawled on the floor, lifeless, her eyes open, staring blankly at nothing. The man grabbed her arm, pulling it towards him. He placed the knife against her wrist and began sawing methodically, as if he was cutting through a piece of meat. A wave of nausea hit me, and I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The sound of the knife slicing through flesh was wet and sickening, each stroke deliberate and cruel. My mother was gone, and these people, these monsters, were desecrating her body like she was nothing. I stumbled back, my vision blurring with tears. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the horror of what I was seeing. My father was gone too, I realized. They had taken everything from me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get back to my room, had to call for help. I turned and ran, nearly tripping over my own feet as I slammed my door shut behind me. "Jason," I hissed into the phone, my voice barely more than a whisper. "They're here. They killed Mom and Dad. I saw them. They're cutting up her body." Jason's voice was urgent, panicked. "Jess, listen to me. You need to get out of there. Right now. Find a way out and run. I'm calling the police. Just hold on." Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I quickly shoved the phone under my pillow, my heart racing. "Jess, honey?" The woman's voice called softly from the other side. "Are you okay? You've been up here for a while. I brought you some tea." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I'm fine," I called back, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just tired. I'll be down in a bit." "All right, dear," she replied sweetly. "Take your time." I waited until her footsteps faded away before retrieving the phone. I needed to think, to plan my next move. But then, I saw it. Another note slipped under the door while I was distracted. The handwriting was the same, scrawled and desperate. "Don't trust anyone. Kill them now or you will face the 6th loop." My hands shook as I read the words. A 6th loop? What did that mean? How many times had this happened before? How many times had I been trapped in this nightmare? I knew what I had to do. There was only one way out of this. I had to end it, once and for all. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I crept down the hallway, a knife hidden in my hand. I could hear them in the living room whispering, plotting. I couldn't let them get away with this. I wouldn't. With a scream, I lunged forward, the knife plunging into the man's back. He fell to the floor with a grunt, and I turned on the woman, my vision red with rage and grief. She raised her hands, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I stabbed again and again, the blade slicing through flesh until they were both still. I stood there, breathing hard, my hands slick with their blood. I had done it. I had stopped them. I had broken the loop. But as the adrenaline faded, I felt the world tilt and go black. When I opened my eyes, the bright white of the hospital room slowly came into focus. The harsh fluorescent lights made my head throb, and I blinked, trying to make sense of where I was. A man stood beside my bed, looking worried and familiar, yet somehow out of place. "Jason?" I croaked, my throat dry, my voice shaky and uncertain. He leaned forward, his face soft but serious, his eyes filled with concern. "Jess, it's me, but I'm not your husband. I'm Dr. Jason Reed, your psychiatrist." I stared at him, the fog in my mind starting to clear. The memories of the house, the imposters, the blood, they felt so vivid, so real. "Where am I? What's going on?" I managed to ask, confusion and fear gripping my chest. "You're in the hospital," Dr. Reed said gently, his tone calm and steady, grounding me in the present. "You've been here for several months ever since the accident and the incident at the villa." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. The villa, my parents, those people. My voice trailed off as the memories came rushing back, a flood of horror and grief. Dr. Reed took a deep breath, his expression a mixture of sadness and compassion. "Just 6 months ago, you and your parents went to that villa for a weekend getaway. 2 escaped convicts, Sam and Lou, broke into the house. They murdered your parents." I felt the room spin around me, my breath catching in my throat as his words sank in. The screams, the sound of shattering glass, the metallic smell of blood, all of it came back in a rush. But I was there. I saw them. I saw what they did. I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "You did," he confirmed softly, nodding. "You were in the kitchen when it happened. You saw everything. But when they realized you were there, you managed to hide in the pantry. That's why they didn't find you. You were the only survivor." I closed my eyes, the tears streaming down my face as I remembered the terror of that night, the way my heart pounded as I crouched in the darkness, praying they wouldn't hear me, praying they wouldn't find me. Why didn't they find me? I asked, my voice breaking. Dr. Reed's voice was gentle, filled with empathy. They were in a hurry, Jess. They were trying to get in and out quickly. They didn't know you were there. When the police arrived, they found you still hiding, in shock, barely responsive. You've been here ever since, struggling with what we call survivor syndrome. Survivor syndrome? I repeated, my brow furrowing as I tried to understand. Survivor syndrome? I repeated, my brow furrowing as I tried to understand. It's a condition where the trauma is so severe, your mind creates alternate realities to protect you from the pain, Dr. Reed explained. In your case, you've been stuck in a loop, reliving different versions of that night, trying to change the outcome to make sense of what happened. Your mind created these hallucinations as a way to cope with the unbearable reality of losing your parents so violently. I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. So, the house, the imposters, the notes, it was all in my head? I whispered, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Dr. Reed nodded. Yes, Jess. Everything you experienced since that night has been a construction of your mind. The imposters were your mind's way of personifying the killers, trying to make sense of the senseless. The loops, the repeated experiences, they were all manifestations of your brain trying to give you control over something that was uncontrollable. My hands were shaking as I tried to process everything he was saying. And Jason, the Jason in my head, he wasn't real either? No, Dr. Reed said softly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. You created him as a source of comfort, someone you could trust when everything else was chaos. Your mind gave you a lifeline, a familiar face in the middle of your nightmare. I looked down at my trembling hands, the memories and the reality clashing in my mind, everything feeling so fragmented, so broken. How do I stop it? How do I get out of this loop? Dr. Reed gave me a small, reassuring smile, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. You've already taken the first step, Jess. By recognizing what's real and what's not. By facing the truth instead of running from it. It's a long road to recovery, but you're not alone. We're here to help you heal, to help you find your way back to a life where the past doesn't hold you prisoner. I nodded, the tears still flowing, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small flicker of hope. It would be a long road and the pain would never fully go away, but maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to live with it, to remember my parents as they were, not as the twisted figures my mind had created, to find my way out of the darkness and into the light.
Ryota Tanaka, a 30-something urban journalist, was known for investigating urban legends, strange events, and unsolved mysteries. His job was risky, but he thrived on the thrill of it. Lately, though, his career had hit a slump. Several of his recent investigative pieces hadn't made much of an impact, and even he found them kind of boring. One night, while working late in his office, he received an anonymous email that would change everything. The email subject was short, but eerie. Do you dare to watch this video? The email body contained just a single link, no other explanation. The link led to some obscure video sharing site that looked outdated and shady, like something from the early days of the internet. This is probably just some phishing scam, Ryota muttered to himself, about to delete the email. But his curiosity got the better of him. As a seasoned reporter, he was drawn to anything strange or mysterious, and this email definitely fit the bill. He clicked the link. The video slowly loaded, the quality grainy and low res. It was about 2 minutes long. The screen was dark at first, the camera slowly panning through what looked like an abandoned factory. Then a shadowy figure appeared in the middle of the screen, their back to the camera, face unclear. They began to mumble something, their voice low and distorted. Ryota leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. He caught something like, "Free your soul."
The video ended abruptly with a flash of a strange symbol, some kind of ancient-looking rune. Ryota frowned. What the hell was that? He shrugged it off and closed the browser, not thinking much of it. That night, weird stuff started happening. First, his phone rang. It was around midnight, and the call was from an unknown number. When he answered, all he heard was a strange buzzing sound, like static mixed with faint whispers. He hung up thinking it was just a random prank. But the next day, things got worse. His friends started telling him they'd received calls from his number, even though he hadn't called anyone. "It was your voice, but it didn't sound like you," one of his friends said. "All it kept saying was 7 days." 7 days? Ryota was starting to feel uneasy. His friends all said they got the same message. Someone or something was using his number to send these creepy calls. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. His phone would randomly reboot, his computer would glitch and open blank windows on its own. At night, he started hearing faint footsteps in his apartment, like someone or something was walking around. The atmosphere grew heavy, and he felt an invisible presence around him constantly. Unable to take it anymore, Ryota decided to investigate. He started with the email. Reaching out to a tech-savvy friend of his named Kitagawa, a well-known hacker, Ryota explained the video and all the weird things that had been happening since watching it. Kitagawa was intrigued and agreed to look into it. A few days later, Kitagawa came back with shocking news. "That video you watched wasn't just some random post," he explained. "It was a part of a live stream that aired a few months ago. The stream was taken down shortly after, and all records of it were wiped." "What was in the stream?" Ryota asked, his heart pounding. "Here's the creepy part," Kitagawa said. "Everyone who watched that live stream, they're dead now." Ryota's blood ran cold. "Dead? What do you mean?" "They all died under mysterious circumstances. No one knows exactly how. It's like they just stopped living." But here's the kicker. Before they died, they all got a phone call. And the message was always the same. 7 days. The hair on the back of Ryota's neck stood up. 7 days. The same message his friends had been receiving. "So what's the deal with this video? Is it cursed or something?" Kitagawa nodded gravely. "It's not just a curse, that symbol at the end of the video. It's some kind of ancient rune. It looks like it's tied to a ritual meant to release the soul from the body. And the video itself? It's using modern tech to make it happen." Ryota's heart raced as the pieces clicked together. The strange phone calls, the heavy feeling of being watched, and now this talk of ancient rituals. If this was true, then the video wasn't just some internet prank. It was a soul trap. Kitagawa kept digging and found that the video had some strange audio frequencies embedded in it. These low-frequency signals weren't audible, but they could subtly affect the viewer's brain, triggering hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually something worse. "I think the video is messing with people's nervous systems, tricking their brains into thinking their soul is separating from their body," Kitagawa explained. "And that's what killed those people?" Ryota asked, his unease growing. "Probably. The symbol combined with the audio could be triggering some kind of psychotic break or worse. I mean, this isn't just supernatural. This is real tech being used in messed up ways. You might not have much time left if it's happening to you." Ryota knew then that the clock was ticking. He had less than 4 days before the 7-day countdown hit 0. With Kitagawa's help, Ryota searched for a way to break the curse. Kitagawa's research led him to believe that the video's curse wasn't irreversible. "The signals and symbols are reversible," he said. "If you reverse the video's playback and play an opposing frequency at the same time, it might neutralize the curse." Kitagawa worked quickly, creating software that would reverse the video and generate the necessary counter frequencies. It was a long shot, but it was their only option. "This is it, Ryota. You have to play the video backward and sync the audio. If the symbol shows up, you hit this button to trigger the reverse frequency." Ryota felt a flicker of hope. It was slim, but it was better than sitting around waiting for something terrible to happen. That night, alone in his dark apartment, Ryota set up his laptop and prepared to run Kitagawa's program. His heart pounded in his chest as he opened the video, now reversed, and pressed play. The eerie figure in the video moved backward, and the strange symbol reappeared, glowing brighter than before. Kitagawa was on the phone with him, guiding him through the steps. "It's almost time. You'll feel it when the signal hits." As the symbol flashed on the screen, Ryota felt a crushing pressure in his chest. His vision blurred, and it felt like something was trying to rip him apart from the inside. He gasped for air, hands shaking as he reached for the button. "Stay focused, man!" Kitagawa's voice was strained. "You're almost there. Just hit the button." Ryota hit the button, and the screen flickered violently. The symbol distorted, the video stuttered, and the low-frequency hum grew louder. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went black. The video stopped, the room fell silent, and Ryota collapsed into his chair, gasping for breath. Had it worked? Ryota let out a sigh of relief, feeling like he had just narrowly escaped death. But before he could fully process what had happened, Kitagawa's call cut out. Confused, Ryota tried calling him back, but the number was suddenly unreachable. Panic set in as he dialed again and again, but it was as if Kitagawa had vanished into thin air. Just then, Ryota's computer screen flickered to life again. The same cursed video that he thought he had beaten started playing automatically. This time, the figure wasn't blurry anymore. It was clear, its eyes locked directly onto Ryota.
"Did you really think you could escape?"
The voice, cold and menacing, echoed from the screen. Ryota's blood froze as he watched, helpless. The figure smiled, and the video link automatically sent itself to all of Ryota's contacts. The phone numbers flashed across his screen as the curse spread to everyone he knew. The curse wasn't over. It was just beginning again. And Ryota knew he couldn't stop it. 7 days. His countdown had restarted.